So we're going to talk about today one of the most important and usually regarded as well as one of the worst decisions ever made by the US Supreme Court. But we need to understand it in context. Okay, so let's look at the US Constitution a little bit so far. The US Constitution sets up a federal government, meaning a government that manages things on behalf of states that are members of that team or union. And within that federal government established by the Constitution, the government gets its existence or is defined by this written document called a Constitution. Okay. The US Constitution has three branches of the federal government. The first branch is talked about in Article 1 of the Constitution, and that's called Congress. It's what writes the laws and has the most powers in the Constitution and the most words written about in the Constitution. Article 2 and the second branch deals with the most well-known, most popular probably branch today, or the branch that you hear the most about, and that's the president or the executive. So it's the president, but it also includes the executive departments that are under the presidency included in that branch. And the second article of the Constitution, where the presidency is talked about, is about half the length of words that are given to the first branch, Congress. The third branch is the judicial branch, or the branch dealing with the federal courts and a Supreme Court. Now, what these courts were for, and the Supreme Court was for, was to deal with constitutional issues, such as what if the United States had a treaty with another country? They made a treaty with another country, but that treaty came into contradiction with one of the laws of the United States. The reason why you'd have a Supreme Court is you'd have a branch that would give you a legal understanding on that matter. Or what if you had a law of the United States that contradicted some aspect of the Constitution? The courts would try to address that. And that's what the Supreme Court was for. And there's some debate about whether its original intent was to give rulings or give insight and opinion on legal matters, because there's very little written about it in the Constitution. And while people today view the Supreme Court as the final authority who gives the final say over what the Constitution says and what it means, there's some debate about that because of the fact that the Supreme Court, just by the amount of words in the Constitution, does not seem to be that as important. And if there are supposed to be three co-equal constitutional branches in the federal government, why would the Supreme Court just be able to make statements about the Constitution and they just become law no matter what? But anyway, the Supreme Court deals with these certain matters of law and national law and the Constitution of the United States. And it can have an impact. The Supreme Court doesn't have an army, doesn't have those type of political powers. However, its political power is more subtle, but it can definitely impact for generations to come. Now, this case that came before the Supreme Court is seen as one of the reasons for leading to the Civil War, because of the decision that the Supreme Court made and the implications of that decision, meaning not just what happened in the decision itself, but the consequences from this decision and what that would mean for the whole United States. So it all centers around this man named Dred Scott, okay, who had been a slave. And you can look up some of his history and things about him. It's kind of an interesting story. But this is what the Supreme Court case had to deal with. Now, remember, there are, in the United States, during this time that we are surveying, there are slave states and there are free states. And the issue with them being in a collection together called the Union or the United States is that you have these two very different situations, and there was always the risk that slaves would escape from a slave state into a free state. Now, in the slave states, slavery is legal. In the free states, slavery is illegal. So, this creates a pretty significant problem. Now, in the Constitution itself, it doesn't use the word slave, but it does say, it has a clause in there, some wording, that talks about anybody who would escape from one state into another, from a slave state into a free state, that slave would have to be returned. But a lot of free states weren't going to do that and refused to do that and they resented that, because this meant that free states where slavery was illegal were having to help prop up and enforce slavery, because they were being told by the Constitution and the US government that they had to return slaves that escaped from where slavery was legal to where slavery was illegal. And so this creates several problems. One of the problems is, if slaves are legally property in one state, does that mean that slaves, when they move to a free state, are still legally property? So, for example, if you drive your car from California into Arizona, your car does not cease legally to be your property. But with slavery, it's a lot more complicated, because in free states, slavery is illegal. In slave states, it's legal. So if a slaveholder crosses into a free state with their slave, does that slave still belong to them as their property? The other issue is this. If you say yes, that means that slavery can now spread potentially into places and be enforced where it is it has been declared illegal. Because if you say, yes, your slave, a slave held in property is your slave no matter where you go in the United States, just like your car. But if you say no, then that means there's a threat against the idea of what kinds of property you can hold in what states. Okay, because the Fifth Amendment of the Constitution says this. Basically, it says that the government cannot take away your life, liberty, or property without due process, meaning they can affect those things. If you've committed a crime, they can take away your property or they can take away your liberty, but there needs to be a court process where they prove that you've committed some type of crime. But the Fifth Amendment basically says that your property is your property everywhere you go in the United States, and the US government is not supposed to interfere with that. And with my example about the car, my car is still my car, whether I have it in California or I have it in Arizona. So that's one side of it, but having legal property in slaves becomes much more complicated. And so this is basically what happened with this individual, Dred Scott. Used to be a slave. He would eventually gain his freedom. But what happened with him was he went with his slaveholder from a slave state into a free state. While he was there, his slaveholder died. Now, if someone dies normally, that means their property transfers ownership to their what's called a next of kin, meaning their next closest family member or their heir. Like if someone dies and their house gets left to their children. But here's one of the complicating factors. Dred Scott is in a free state where slavery is illegal. So the question is, should he legally be returned to the family of his slaveholder, since he was legally regarded as property, or do those laws not apply since he is in a free state where slavery is illegal? And so a decision was made actually in favor of Dred Scott that, free states will not enforce slavery. And so if a slave is in a free state and their slaveholder dies, they are free. Slavery is not enforceable in that case. But then the case was taken over and brought up to the Supreme Court. And the Supreme Court had a fairly tough legal decision to make, because either way they say on this issue, there is a significant problem. If they say, yes, you can take yes, slaves are property everywhere in the Union, that means slavery cannot really be declared illegal in the Union. So that means that if people can move slaves from slave states into free states, and still maintain them as property, that basically takes away from the fact that states have declared slavery illegal. It would basically say you can't enforce that. We're going to bring in, you could potentially bring slaves into there. And what good is it if slavery is illegal if people can still bring their slaves into those areas and have the law enforced regarding them as their property? So that's one side of it. On the other side of it, if they say, no, Dred Scott and others like him would be free in this case, that's basically going against the Fifth Amendment, because since slaves were legally property, that would basically be saying a state could, as anywhere in the United States, that a state could simply declare you don't own your property anymore. And so we see the internal tension and contradiction with the idea of owning people as property, that it's not it's not a legitimate concept or category to own people against their will, kidnap and enforce labor against them that they have not consented to. And so it creates this problem. So the Supreme Court basically made a decision. They decided that in favor of saying, yes, Dred Scott must be returned because he is legally property. They cite the Fifth Amendment. They say, yeah, government cannot interfere with your property. Now, this is a big issue because when the Fifth Amendment also talks about government not interfering with your life, liberty, or property without due process, it's referring to the US government. But what was going on with Dred Scott was between state governments. So now you have the US government applying standards of the Constitution to state governments rather than having it applied just against itself. And so this is now an encroachment on the authority of free states. In addition to that, it means now that even though slavery is illegal in free states, technically people could move slaves into free states and not have a problem, which means basically it rolls back the idea that in those states slavery is illegal. So you have now the US Supreme Court telling, in effect, free states that their ending of slavery is meaningless. And this decision of the Supreme Court, which is not an easy one to figure out, to be fair, but this decision of the Supreme Court, an encroachment on the free states, on their power and authority, was a great advantage theoretically to slavery, because it meant that slavery would not just continue to exist where it existed and not expand, but it also meant that now slavery could enter into free states. Also, the Supreme Court made the decision based around who were citizens at the time the Constitution was adopted. And the quote from the actual decision said, "Neither the class of persons who had been imported as slaves nor their descendants, whether they had become free or not, were then acknowledged as part of the people. So one of the arguments that they made is Dred Scott was not technically a citizen because he descended from African slaves who had been imported. And when the Constitution was decided, when the Constitution was accepted, the slaves were not technically citizens. Therefore, if they were not technically citizens, and Dred Scott is a descendant of individuals like these, and then Dred Scott is not a citizen. And if Dred Scott is not a citizen, he is not entitled to sue in court to maintain his freedom. So it's kind of a technicality there on defining the fact now explicitly from the Supreme Court, defining the fact that slaves were not citizens, and even more so defining the fact that anybody who is descended from slaves that were imported from Africa were not citizens, because they looked at who was a citizen at the time the US Constitution was adopted. Case also decided that since slaves are property, the government cannot interfere with property because of the Fifth Amendment. Then this famous statement, not in a good way, but famous statement from the Dred Scott case, says the right of property in a slave is distinctly and expressly affirmed in the Constitution. Now, slavery anywhere in the Union had to be enforced everywhere in the Union, not just in slave states, not just returning escaped slaves, but slavery even had to be enforced in free states where slavery had long been declared illegal. The right of property in slaves is distinctly and expressly affirmed in the Constitution. And that statement, while it is acknowledging that slaves are property, it's calling them property, and we recognize all the problems with that, it is true that the Constitution did, in a limited way, acknowledge that, even though it doesn't expressly use the word slaves. This is why, actually, a lot of the abolitionists, the people who were the small minority, but vocal minority against slavery during this time, why they wanted to get rid of the Constitution. They wanted to break up the Union because they believed it was the Constitution and the US federal government that was continuing to force them to artificially enforce slavery. Through decisions like this, through things like the promise of the Corwin Amendment, through the fugitive slave laws, meaning you had to return escaped slaves, help enforce slavery, going all the way back to the fugitive slave clause originally in the Constitution. And so we see, leading up to the Civil War, there are actually several actions of the federal government that are put in place to protect slavery. The Corwin Amendment was almost the 13th Amendment to change the Constitution to say the US government would not interfere with slavery in the states. It was approved by the House and the Senate. It was approved by outgoing President Buchanan, and it would be approved directly in his speech by incoming President Abraham Lincoln. So you've got Congress offering to change the Constitution to protect slavery where it existed. You've got two presidents, one leaving and one coming in, saying that they approve this type of amendment. And now you've got the Supreme Court saying that slavery is protected in the Constitution, and not only protected in slave states, but it must also be legally protected in free states. And so you have lots, and then you have the federal government also in Congress coming up with the fugitive slave laws in the Compromise of 1850, which the Compromise of 1850, which we'll talk about, had several things going on with it, but it also said that it would enforce stricter versions of the fugitive slave laws that would force free slaves to return escaped slaves. So when we say slavery is the focal point of the Civil War and the main cause of the Civil War, what we have to deal with is it's a little more complicated than what people think, because the US federal government is doing lots of things to try to prop up slavery and to protect slavery and enforce it and keep the Union together. But what starts to happen is, in doing that, the US federal government starts to anger the free states. And the free states start to say, we are not going to follow this stuff. And the slave states say, they're not following what the US government is telling them to do. Yet they want us to follow what the US government is telling us to do. And eventually, the southern states, several of them, and not every person, there are lots of people who did not want this, but they get together and they vote in convention to exit the Union. And then there's some fighting and things that happen, and then a war is fought that does not acknowledge that they have seceded. It says that fights to keep them part of the United States. So that is how slavery is at the core of that. But it's actually, most people don't understand that the US government was doing several things leading up to the Civil War that were trying to protect slavery. But in doing so, this creates more tension between the North and the South as they struggle for power in the Union. And therefore, this is going to lead to a breaking point and a war. And so this is how the Dred Scott decision helps to contribute to that situation.